The fateful morning, when light struck starving eyes. At the edge of the Texas desert, where sunlight burned each grain of sand into silence, Thaddius Bear Mallister lived alone on a barren patch of land somewhere between Amarillo and nowhere. At 34, Bear was used to the harsh stillness of this place. The wind blew like the sighs of ancient spirits. The sun blazed like wordless warnings. That day, he was repairing a broken fence post near a small creek on the western side of his ranch. Under the scorching sun, sweat soaked through his old wool shirt. Bear straightened up to stretch his back, eyes sweeping across the cracked earth, when he noticed a movement. A small figure, stumbling, as if pushed forward by the wind. A child, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her clothes were traditional native garments, tattered, threadbare, as if her very soul had been shredded along with the fabric. Bear didn't need to look closely to understand. The child wasn't just hungry. She was disintegrating from hunger. Her skinny legs zigzagged across the land, as if the earth itself refused to carry such a fragile body. And then Bear saw her eyes far too large for her sunken face, brimming with tears, fear, desperation, and something else unnamed, the primal instinct to survive. Most ranchers around here would have gone straight for their rifle. The tension between settlers and the Comanche wasn't news. It was the air they breathed, present in the wind and at the dinner table. But Bear wasn't like most. Maybe he was odd, maybe too soft, or maybe he was still human. He set down his tools. He didn't call out, didn't threaten. He simply walked toward the child with empty hands, slow and steady, like someone approaching a dying fawn. As he got closer, he saw her lips were cracked and bleeding, her small hands twitching, either from cold or fear. She spoke, quick Comanche words he didn't understand, but the message was clear. She pointed at her mouth, then toward the creek. Hunger, thirst, dying. Bear remembered a story Pete Morrison had told at the blacksmith's shop the week before, about the beaded necklaces worn by the family of White Bull, the Comanche war chief. Sacred patterns, handmade, full of meaning. And he saw them, peeking out beneath the torn collar of her shirt. That necklace. Bear's heart slowed a beat. This wasn't just a Comanche child. She was the only daughter of the most feared leader in the region. One wrong move and he wouldn't just lose his ranch. He'd lose his life, and the entire valley might bleed for it. But Bear didn't retreat. He bent down and lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. Her body trembled in his grip like a bird blown from its nest by a violent gust. She didn't resist, had no strength left to. A man's choice, and the burden of kindness. Bear's cabin wasn't much bigger than a horse stall, but that night, it became the only warm place for miles. When he laid the Comanche girl gently into his old wooden chair, the one he used to sit in when thinking about his long-lost wife and child, she said nothing. Her eyes shut, her head drooped like a flower beaten down by frost. Bear hurried to prepare food. The old iron pot still held some leftover stew from the previous night. A fresh loaf of bread sat on the table, soft from that morning's bake. As the scent of the food filled the room, the girl stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open as if her soul was fighting its way back into her body. Bear placed the bowl in front of her, but his hand froze midair. Beneath the flickering firelight, he saw it again, the necklace around her neck. Sacred Comanche beadwork, unmistakable. The exact pattern Pete Morrison had described just a week earlier, belonging only to the family of Chief White Bull. This wasn't just any child. She was the chief's only daughter. And if anyone knew he was harboring her, he wouldn't just lose his ranch. He'd bring death upon himself and maybe upon the whole region. But still, Bear couldn't turn her away. He handed her the bowl. Her hands trembled so violently that the stew nearly spilled, but she began eating, fast, desperate, as if every bite pushed death further away. In that moment, Bear no longer saw an enemy or a Comanche. He saw a starving child who simply wanted to live. When she finished, her body gave in. She fell asleep within minutes, slumped in the chair, the bowl empty in her lap. Bear took his only blanket and gently laid it over her. Then he sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker, like the voice of his conscience whispering in the dark. Hoofbeats. 3 riders. Fast. Bear stood up instantly, heart pounding. Someone was coming. Outside were 3 familiar figures. Cletus Hartwell, his neighbor, along with Deputy Jake Morrison and Reverend Thomas. 3 men Bear had known for years, but now they sat on horseback with grim, drawn faces. Before Bear could speak, Cletus shouted from the saddle. Bear, have you lost your damn mind? Jake saw smoke signals from the hills. The Comanche are looking for someone. Word is Chief White Bull's daughter went missing 3 days ago. You know anything about that? Bear swallowed hard. He could lie. He could stall. But these men were part of his life, and something about this night demanded truth. She's inside, he said quietly. Half-starved. I couldn't let her die. Silence fell like a dropped hammer. Even the horses stood still. Reverend Thomas spoke first, barely above a whisper. Son, do you understand what you've done? I helped a starving child, Bear replied. But even as he said it, he knew how naive it sounded. Cletus started pacing on foot, running his hands through his hair. They're gonna think you took her. Hell, they probably already think that. White Bulls burned settlements for less. Deputy Morrison turned toward his horse. I have to report this, Bear, but I'll give you a head start. Take her back before they find you here. In the dark, Bear asked, glancing toward the cabin. She can barely walk. How am I supposed to approach a Comanche camp without getting shot full of arrows? That's your problem now, Morrison said, mounting up. I'm riding to town to warn the others. If White Bull decides to make an example out of you, he might not stop with just your ranch. The 3 men rode off into the night, leaving Bear alone again. He looked up at the sky. No moon. No stars. Just the weight of the decision he'd made. And then, drums. Distant at first. Rhythmic. Measured. But they were getting closer. Bear turned back inside, bolted the door. The girl slept on, unaware that the sound approaching was not salvation, but reckoning. They weren't waiting for dawn. The Comanche were coming tonight. The war drums, and 200 warriors in the night. Drums. At first, it was just a distant echo, like thunder locked away in a canyon. But beat by beat, the sound grew louder. Not rushed, not chaotic. Each strike was deliberate, as if death itself had a rhythm. Bear stood inside his cramped wooden cabin, watching the Comanche girl still slumped in his old chair. Her tiny hands clutched his blanket. Her face less pale now thanks to the humble bowl of stew. This child, somehow, had broken down all the barriers in Bear's mind. She wasn't the other anymore. She was a life he had chosen to protect. But that very life might now ignite a fire that would consume everything. Bear ran outside, scanning the darkness. The night air tightened, thick like boiling oil. On the horizon, shapes began to emerge. First, they looked like shadows crawling from the earth. Then clearer, like phantoms in a dream. 200 warriors on horseback, riding forward in perfect formation, as if the night itself had drawn its sword. They didn't scream, didn't raise weapons. They came in silence, the kind of silence that only belonged to those who had already decided who would live and who would die. Bear rushed back inside, bolting the door, though he knew it was as useless as a prayer in a flood. The girl still slept, but not for long. They weren't waiting for dawn. The Comanche were coming now. The drums grew louder, measured, thunderous, terrifying. Not the wild beat of a raiding party. No, this was something else. Something organized. Something final. The girl stirred. Her eyes opened wide as the drums echoed through the floorboards. And in that moment, Bear saw something change in her face. Recognition. She knew what the drums meant better than he did. She babbled something in Comanche, frantic, her small fingers pointing toward the window, then at herself. Though Bear didn't understand her words, he saw the urgency in her gestures. She was trying to warn him, desperately. He knelt beside her, trying to stay calm. I don't know if you understand me, little one, he said gently, but I'm trying to help you. Those drums? They're your people, aren't they? She nodded vigorously, then grabbed his shirt and pulled him toward the window. There, with her fingers, she began counting. Open, close. Open, close. 10, 20, 30. Bear followed her count until she reached 200. His knees nearly gave out. He'd hoped for maybe a dozen angry braves, something he could reason with. But 200? That was enough to level every ranch for 50 miles. The drums suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. Bear peeked through the window. First he saw nothing, then shapes, emerging from the dark like ghosts made of smoke and blood. The warriors fanned out in a wide arc, forming a ring around his cabin. They rode in silence, their war paint glowing pale under the moonlight. Feathers swayed, spears glinted, eyes watched. These were not men who came to talk. The girl tugged on Bear's sleeve, motioning toward the door, then herself. She wanted to go to them, but would that help? Or doom them both? What if they thought he'd harmed her? A voice rang out from the darkness. Clear, cold, heavy with power. White man, it said, with an accent thick but precise. You have taken what is ours. Send out the girl, and perhaps you will live to see morning. Bear's mouth went dry. That voice, it had to be Chief White Bull. Bear had only heard legends. That he'd never lost a battle. That he'd united warring tribes. That he could call thunder with his war cry. And now Bear stood face to face with him. Not across a battlefield, but across a decision that could bury them all. Bear stepped toward the door. The girl grabbed his arm, her small fingers digging into his skin. She shook her head violently, then made a slashing motion across her neck. She was trying to say something. No, trying to stop something. And then it hit him. She wasn't just White Bull's daughter. She was his only daughter. In Comanche culture, that made her sacred both as family and as future. If anything had happened to her while under Bear's roof, even unintentionally, White Bull would be bound by honor to make an example so brutal, no settler would dare approach their land again. Bear realized with growing horror. Saving the girl had been the easy part. Now he had to prove to 200 armed warriors that he had saved her, not stolen her. And he had about 30 seconds to figure out how. The face of hatred and the accusation of history. The wind blew harder now. Not just the desert breeze, but something heavier. The kind of wind that carried destiny. Sweeping through hundreds of bowstrings pulled taut and silent warriors poised like statues carved from the night. White Bull stood face to face with Bear, no longer merely a father, but a force. His eyes were not the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of a judge, of history, of bloodlines stretched over generations of war and survival. You will prove your heart, he said, his voice low and sharp as a blade. Bear didn't move. Any wrong motion, even a twitch, could be the signal that unleashed 100 arrows into his chest. He drew a slow breath. I kept this, Bear said, carefully reaching into his pocket. Not as a trophy, but because I thought you might need it. He pulled out a torn scrap of fabric, small, faded, with a few sacred beads still attached. It was part of the girl's ceremonial dress, the one she had worn when she snagged on his fence. Silent proof. White Bull took it. His fingers touched the beads, and Bear saw something shift, just slightly, in the war chief's eyes. Recognition, maybe even a memory. She came to my water, Bear said softly. I could have chased her away, could have shot her, but I didn't. Carried her home, fed her, gave her my only blanket. I asked for nothing. Silence, so sharp it rang. Suddenly, the girl tugged her father's arm and pointed to the cabin. She ran ahead, gesturing excitedly. Bear followed, heart pounding. Inside, she pointed to the wooden chair she had slept in, to the empty bowl on the table, then to a small photograph, framed, old, worn from years past. A woman and a boy, both with gentle eyes and a quiet sadness. My family, Bear said softly beside White Bull. My wife and son. Lost them to cholera 3 years ago. I keep that photo there, to remind myself there's still something worth protecting. White Bull picked up the photo. His rough hand touched the image gently. She says, he translated after listening to the girl. She saw the sadness in your eyes, that you helped her not because of greed or strategy, but because you knew what loss was. Bear nodded, throat tight. My son was her age. Maybe that's why I couldn't let her die. White Bull remained still for a long moment. When he finally turned to speak, his voice had regained its cold edge. I cannot return with empty hands, he said. My people came for justice. They cannot go home and say we found nothing but kindness. That would make me look weak. Bear understood. Do what you must to me, he replied. But let the child live. I won't be the reason more innocent blood is spilled. That's when another man stepped forward, face marked with rage, spear in hand, eyes burning. Broken arrow. He shouted something in Comanche. Fast, harsh, a challenge. Bear didn't need a translation to know. It was a call for punishment, an accusation, a verdict. Some warriors behind him began to move, slowly, shifting with the anticipation of blood. White Bull responded quiet, firm. The two stood locked in a tense standoff. Tradition against change. Honor against restraint. Past against possibility. Then, without warning, the girl stepped between them. Her voice, high and young, sliced through the night like lightning in a storm. She spoke quickly, clearly, with a fire Bear had never seen in her before. White Bull translated. She's telling the truth. About the storm. About getting lost. About how she thought she would die until this man saved her. About the food. The blanket. The photo. The sadness in his eyes. The girl now turned to address all the warriors around them. Her voice grew stronger, steadier. She says, if we punish someone for kindness, then we become exactly what the white soldiers say we are, savages. If we kill this man, we lose the very thing we're trying to protect. Even Broken Arrow hesitated. She's asking him, White Bull continued in awe, if he has children. She's asking what he would want a stranger to do if his child were dying alone on the prairie. Broken Arrow's spear lowered slightly. The girl wasn't done. She walked among the warriors now, pointing to Bear, then to herself, then miming eating, sleeping, and holding the photograph. She was no longer just a child. She was a witness, a bridge. She says, White Bull whispered, if we destroy mercy, we destroy ourselves. Silence. 200 warriors, frozen. Finally, Broken Arrow spoke again, softly this time. White Bull translated. He says, perhaps the spirits sent us not an enemy, but a teacher. That maybe wisdom comes from the smallest voices. The air shifted. Tension melted, not into peace, but into a possibility of peace. White Bull turned to Bear, a look in his eyes that might have been respect. My daughter has done something remarkable, he said. She turned a war party into a council. Then his voice grew serious again. But now comes the hardest part. What's that? Bear asked. You must now prove to the elders that her faith in you was justified. Tonight, in our village, in front of those who have hated your people all their lives. He gestured toward his horse. Are you ready to bet your life on a child's word? Bear looked at the girl. This time, her eyes were not pleading. They were offering, and that changed everything. The girl's voice, and the battle within men's hearts. They left the ranch just as the stars began to fade, a soft orange bruise forming at the edge of the Texas sky. Bear rode an old horse lent to him by one of the warriors, following White Bull and the silent procession into terrain he'd never crossed before. No one spoke. No one needed to. They passed through narrow canyons, hidden paths, and shadows that seemed to recognize only Comanche footsteps. When they arrived at the village, darkness still blanketed the world, but the place was alive with fire. Fires everywhere, not for warmth but for clarity. In the center of the village was a circle of stones. Seated there were 7 elders, men with hair as white as bone and eyes that had seen too much to still believe in miracles. Bear was led to the center of the circle. No ropes, no weapons pointed at him. But none were needed. The weight of their gaze alone was enough to crush any man. White Bull stepped forward and began speaking in Comanche, his voice low and steady. He recounted everything. The storm, the lost child, the stew, the photo, the torn fabric. He made no excuses. He did not shield Bear from the truth. Then Broken Arrow spoke. Though he had relented earlier, the fire in his blood had not cooled. He spoke of tradition, justice, and vengeance. His voice grew louder, harder, like steel clanging against stone. Though Bear couldn't understand the words, he felt them like blows to the chest. Then came the girl. She stepped into the firelight. No paint, no ceremonial dress. Just a child with dust on her cheeks and fire in her heart. And she spoke. Every word clear, every sentence rising like prayer and judgment all at once. She told the elders of the storm, of getting lost, of nearly dying. She told them about Bear's arms carrying her to warmth, about the stew, the blanket, the photo, about the eyes that knew sorrow. When she finished, one of the elders, the oldest among them, asked a single question. White Bull turned to Bear and translated. He asked her, "Do you truly believe this man would risk his life again to save a Comanche child, knowing what it might cost?" She answered without pause. "Yes." Not in Comanche. In English. It hung in the firelight like the first dawn after a long war. The elders began murmuring to one another, voices like rustling leaves on ancient trees. Bear stood still, heart pounding, sweat on his back cold as death. Finally, the white-haired elder rose. When he spoke, the firelight seemed to still around him. White Bull translated. He says, "Tonight the spirits did not send us a battle, but a test. Not of our strength, but of our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy." Bear's legs nearly gave out. But the elder wasn't finished. "You will return safely to your land. No Comanche shall harm you or your home. Any who do will answer to this council." Bear could barely breathe. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "There is one condition," White Bull continued. "If ever one of our people comes to you, hungry, wounded, or lost, you must give them the same kindness you gave her. Not out of fear, but because it is right." "I promise," Bear said without hesitation. Then something no one expected happened. The girl ran to Bear and threw her arms around him. Her voice, soft but sure, broke the silence. "Thank you for saving me. Now, I save you." Dawn after judgment, where trust turns foes into people. They left the village just before first light, as the last stars faded into the pale hush of Texas dawn. Bear rode at the edge of the Comanche formation, no longer a prisoner or an enemy, but something different. Not yet a friend, perhaps something rarer. A man who had been truly seen. No one spoke on the journey back. They didn't need to. The land seemed quieter now. The shadows that once felt like threats now felt like witnesses to something sacred. When they reached Bear's cabin, the sun had just begun to stretch its gold over the dry hills, lighting up the broken fence, the worn porch, and the place where everything had begun. White Bull dismounted first. He walked toward Bear with the slow dignity of a man who had survived too many losses to celebrate, but enough wisdom to recognize a turning point. In his hands was a bracelet, made of leather, eagle feathers, and turquoise stones, a symbol of peace and sacred oath. "You will no longer be seen as our enemy," White Bull said. "From this day forward, your land is neutral ground. Any Comanche who harms you, or what belongs to you, will answer to our council." Bear bowed his head and took the bracelet, his hands trembling slightly. "I can't promise I'll understand your people," he said quietly. "But I promise I'll treat them right. I'll treat them the way I'd want my boy treated." White Bull nodded, and in his eyes, Bear saw not fear, not suspicion, but recognition. Two fathers. Two men who had both buried something they loved. The others turned to leave one by one. Horses lifted dust into the warming air. Only the girl lingered behind. She turned back toward Bear and smiled. "Next year, I visit again," she said, her English clumsy, but full of hope. Bear smiled. "I'll cook stew," he replied. And for the first time both laughed, not out of relief but out of something gentler. Something healing. Years passed. People remembered that night. The night that could have ended in fire and blood, but didn't. Bear never became rich. never became famous. But his cabin, his little patch of dry land between Amarillo and nowhere, became something more valuable than gold. A place of peace. Settlers and Comanche alike came there, to rest, to talk, to share a fire and a bowl of stew. Some came in silence. Others came with stories, but all came knowing they would be safe. The Comanche called it the Quiet Land, because there were no guns.
No curses.
Just the sound of fire, laughter, and sometimes a young voice speaking two languages at once. The girl, once starving, once nearly lost, grew into a leader among her people, a translator, a bridge. Each year, on the same day, she would return to Bear's Ranch to share a meal, not out of obligation but to remember, to remind, that sometimes you don't need miracles to change the world. Just a bowl of stew, a warm blanket, and someone who chooses compassion instead of fear. Bear lived to the age of 73. He died in his sleep, sitting in his favorite chair, a photo of his wife and son resting near his heart. The bracelet White Bull had given him was still wrapped around his wrist, worn, but never removed. At his funeral, both white settlers and Comanche stood side by side. Some shared whiskey, others shared silence. But no one raised their voice in hate, because once, in a world of violence and vengeance, one man chose to carry a starving child instead of turning away. And sometimes that is enough.